Takshashila's 2025 China Challenge Survey is your opportunity to have a say in how India approaches China today and in the years to come. So zoom out, weigh in, and make your voice heard. Take the survey today. Link in description.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. My name is Kripa Koshi, and I'm a program manager here at the Takshashila Institution. And today I have two very special guests with me. I'm going to take a moment to introduce them before we sort of uncover our topic of discussion today, which is increasing R&D spending in India. So our two guests who join me are from our PGP program. So that's our postgraduate program in public policy, for which I'm the program manager. And so for me, it's, in my very unbiased opinion, really lovely to have two of our students here joining us. And I'm going to reveal now, not too much suspense is building. I feel like I just need to introduce our two guests. So first, a very warm welcome to Rohan. Rohan works in marketing consulting and joined our program in June. And then Meher is our second guest today, who is a biochemist by training and also similarly joined our 9th cohort. So I'm going to set a little bit of context, but before I do that, warm welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm just going to jump right into it to sort of explain to our audience what brings you and really all of us here together. So we're just fresh off of a in-person workshop that we conducted in Goa, where the objective really of our time together was to meet in person and go through a policy simulation exercise. Each of the students was assigned to a particular group and had the opportunity to select a policy topic, to choose between two policy topics essentially, and to develop a policy solution that they feel best suited the problem at hand. So the team that Meher and Rohan represent, as they presented through the workshop, did really an excellent job. But as a panel who was evaluating their policy solution, we really did feel that they presented a really strong and compelling case and essentially did excellently. And we want to sort of share their policy thoughts and solutions, I guess, for this particular issue. So going into our topic at hand, for those who might be familiar with the R&D landscape in India, we know that India's gross expenditure on R&D is actually 0.6 to 0.7% of its GDP and has looked fairly stagnant over the past 2 decades. By and large, we know that India's spending is lower than the global average, and it also lags behind some other emerging economies. And so we know that this lower R&D investment has this ripple effect, right? So it limits innovation, productivity gains, technological progress. We know that countries that also underinvest in R&D, they actually struggle to transition eventually to higher income levels. They really struggle to also develop high-value industries or to maintain this competitive edge. And we know that in India, because there's this problem of relatively low R&D spending, there have been these consequences of a lag in innovation or adopting advanced tech, which in turn will slow its tech adoption, weakens its global competitiveness, right? So we have sort of identified that this is sort of an area that we perhaps need a little bit of continued attention on and sort of to come up with new and innovative solutions. So with that sort of scope set, the task really that was given to Meher and Rohan's team and really all of our students this past weekend was to develop a solution and present it as such to a senior decision maker or a senior policy maker. And so they worked with these conditions. They had to develop a problem statement essentially and then identify a solution. So I will stop taking airtime so that I can hear from both of our guests today. And first, I'll maybe turn things over to Rohan, who I think it would be helpful, for our listeners to understand what was the problem statement that your team essentially identified in this thematic area, Rohan.
Right. Thank you, Kripa. So I think, you already explained what the premise was, but our primary purpose was to address India's chronic R&D deficit and perhaps the structural imbalance that is there with the government and private sector spendings. We've already discussed this quite a few times, but India's investment in R&D from the GDP is only about 0.6% to 0.7%, which is half of the peer average. And when we do look at the empirical evidence, it shows that an increase of just 1% in business, public, and foreign R&D can contribute towards 0.13%, 0.17%, or 4% respectively to the productivity growth. What we're trying to figure out is, how can we, increase this innovation spend, which is termed as GERD, which is the gross expenditure on R&D, and how we can leverage it in the most efficient way to get the right outcomes. And I think what our team set out to do was try and address some of the core pillars that we thought were crucial causes for a lot of the effects that were at the end of the day creating the issue at large. So I think just to get set context of what the solution was trying to address, we just have to understand what Viksit Bharat 2047 goals are trying to execute. It's about figuring out an India that is developed, and for that you essentially do need an R&D investment and a research talent pool and an ecosystem that is able to help India in the right possible way. We came up with a Yojana that is targeting two primary pillars. One being the 3,000 Indian PhD students that we would want to be, supporting with funding opportunities at world-class universities, and having a commitment to return and leverage that learning that they've garnered from across the world to be able to develop really unique solutions for India. And the other one was, of course, to try and increase the private sector spending share in the whole GERD metric that we are looking at. Now, I would love to hear from Meher as well, because I think she will be able to take us through the solution in more in-depth analysis. But what this was a brief introduction to what we are trying to address with the overall solution.
Thanks, Rohan, for very clearly laying out our problem statement. So as you very well mentioned, that there's a structural imbalance in the private sector and public sector funding in India for research. So what we got from our analysis was that private sector funding is a huge player in developed economies in R&D. And in India, that's the opposite case. It's the government that has been funding a lot of R&D. And we wanted to figure out how to fix that. So there is this whole pipeline of taking a problem from the lab and bringing it out to life, right? Bringing it out to the market. So we found out that there are two bottlenecks that need to be addressed that might help unlock this potential and kind of propel this whole process forward. And that is where our Bharat AVISHKAAR Yojana comes into place. So as Rohan clearly mentioned, it's kind of built on two legs. So there is one bottleneck that we don't have a lot of talent in R&D, particularly to propel innovation forward. And number two, the other problem being that private funding is very low in R&D. So to address the first problem of global talent issues, we took inspiration from China's 1,000 Talents program. In that, the government could actually find 3,000 talented PhD students and fund their PhDs abroad, in the sense that the government gives them 80% of their funding and they put up 20% of it to make sure they have skin in the game. And this funding would be conditional on them to return to India for a minimum of 5 years to come and work here. And it can be in any sector of their choice. So we don't want to restrict them to particularly academic institutions or startups. They can do what they want, but they bring some of their know-how back and propel the research ecosystem forward. The second bottleneck is the private sector funding that our scheme is looking to address. So in India, the private sector is investing only 2% in R&D as opposed to the 30 to 55% that private sector spends in developed economies. So to kind of address this gap, we looked at incentivizing the private sector R&D funding with tax breaks and tax credits. So to enhance tax credits to 150% would help propel and incentivize the private sector to put in money in R&D, because this is work with long gestation periods. It's high risk. So if we can somehow incentivize them to put up the money and save them money by tax credits, this might kind of propel them to invest it there. And again, there is an ecosystem issue that IP protection is not very strong in India. So even if people come up with solutions, they're scared that IP enforcement is weak and they will not be able to benefit completely from all the money they've spent in R&D. So alongside, there is an ecosystem building that we would like this scheme to address, where we strengthen IP protection and have special courts that look into strengthening IP in India. And I think those are the two main areas that our scheme would focus on to kind of strengthen this whole pipeline of R&D.
That's really helpful actually to hear, Meher. And I think what I appreciate also about your group is you've been trying to be very mindful of, in some ways, the context in which, some of these researchers may find themselves, and also sort of identifying like where could we actually be maybe nudging or incentivizing maybe a little bit more involvement from players that, like you rightly identified, have been somewhat missing from this bigger conversation. So I think that's really helpful for folks to sort of see the high level sort of vision of what you're trying to get at. I know you had spent a fair bit of time thinking through practically how does this play out, right? Like you had a few sort of very concrete sort of actions, I think, that your team laid out really well of if this is in fact the intention with which, or these are the two sort of bottlenecks you've identified, what would be good sort of enabling actions to I don't know where that analogy goes. How do you clear a bottleneck? You ease a bottleneck, maybe. So yeah, so maybe I'll open the floor with that question. What would be some of the concrete actions that you were sort of thinking, and sort of what the scope of maybe the timeline, or perhaps even at a high level the cost maybe for some of these things.
So we're looking at all ministries collaborating here, right? These are two somewhat different solutions addressing the same problem. So on the 1,000 Talents program front, we want the Ministry of Education to be highly involved because they have been looking at granting PhDs in India, and we would like for them to set up a commission, a National Talent Commission, which actually looks at applications and sets criteria for funding these 3,000 PhDs abroad. And then on the private sector side, we're looking at the Ministry of Finance being involved heavily and kind of making these tax breaks possible and keeping them running for the next 10 years at least, so that we know that the private sector is kind of incentivized to look into increasing their funding. And then we're also hoping to get the Ministry of Commerce involved, and they would be involved in strengthening the IP protection and enforcement of specialized IP courts and trained enforcement officers. A lot of this infrastructure already exists in India. So when we were doing our analysis, we found that the state capacity to address these problems and to put these solutions in practice would actually not be a lot. And this was also one of the reasons we took these solutions and thought that these would be the best alternatives to address. So we would like the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Commerce, and that of Education to be involved. And then we also came up with some numbers on the funding for all of this. So the first one is, of course, giving tax breaks. And we know that government revenue is already low. So the government would, of course, have to give up some of its revenue. And we projected this would be around 4,000 crores that the government would have to give up in revenue by giving this 150% tax break. And then we also have the 3,000 PhDs that we want to kind of fund. And for that, we came up with the number of about 350 crores that the government would have to spend overall for each PhD. And we're targeting 3,000 PhD students. Alongside, we kind of want to keep the scheme also outcome oriented. We want to keep judging its outcomes so that we know that we're going in the right direction. So the 3,000 PhDs program, we hope to kind of have it set in and done in 8 to 10 years so that we can look at the kind of outcomes it generated.
Okay, super. I think it's really, thank you, Meher, for sort of what you outlined over there, sort of the cost outlay. I think it would be helpful to sort of double click on one of the things that you mentioned about the projected outcomes. So I know that's something that your team obviously cared a fair bit amount of about. So I'm just going to turn maybe to Rohan to sort of elaborate a little bit more on what your team was sort of seeing as the projected outcomes for this initiative.
Right. Thank you. So, regarding the outcomes, we were really trying to focus on the causes and potentially the right measures, and not something that would, not help us assess the policy success in the right possible way. Towards this attempt, the measures that we were able to highlight after the first 5 years were, around 1,500 PhD graduates from the Global Talent Program coming through, so that we could be leveraging their expertise in the right capacity. One of the most important metrics that we considered was the increase in number of papers published per year by around 15 to 20% per annum. That would be up from the current 9 to 12%. This is a very important statistic because not enough papers are being published despite the structures we have in place. And of course, the RAS for a growth rate of the number of deep tech startups that should increase by 15 to 20% over the baseline annually. I think, we obviously had long-term metrics as well that, we would have the final 1,500 graduates of the global TAN program by the 8th year. And after 10 years of the scheme, the number of paid-ins per year should increase by 25% per annum, up from the current 13 to 24%. And what we were hoping was that these outcomes, which are based on the actual causes, would be able to give us a very fair picture of what the improvements have been across the industry.
Yeah, that's really, I think, useful to map out where you want for some of these policy actions to take us, right? Especially again, if we're setting our sight maybe on this idea of what are the concrete steps needed to achieve the ambition of Viksit Bharat, then it's good to sort of speak in these concrete terms. Now, sorry to be a bit of a downer, but I do know it's not all good news and this perfect solution. I know that your team also spent a fair bit of time trying to think through what might be some of the unintended consequences, where could be some of the weak spots that might need a little bit more support or might be more challenging when trying to develop this solution. So maybe, either one of you, Meher or Rohan, if you want to touch on what you felt some of those, possible unintended consequences could be, what some of the challenges could be when trying to implement something like this.
Yeah, exactly. As you rightly put it, there will always be consequences and unknowns, but we've tried to project some of those. So we do think on the tax breaks that we're offering the private sector, we're hoping that the money goes into research, but it could be that it's directed elsewhere and they try to game the subsidy system. And I think as a way to look out for that, it would be important to strengthen the auditing system and also maybe make compliance stricter so that we look at their compliance by the number of patents filed, the number of papers filed, product market demonstration, so that we kind of reduce the risk of misuse on that front and try to mitigate this consequence that way. Then on our 3,000 PhD students whose PhDs we're funding, there is, of course, the issue that scholars do not want to return. And to mitigate that, we would look into strict bond agreements that would be signed beforehand and compliances ensured so that if the government is spending an amount of money and subsidizing their education, in case they do not want to return, they also owe the government 3x of that back. And by enforcing these strict laws, we're hoping that there is no misuse happening and we're able to achieve the consequences we do. There will also, of course, be people who are not happy with the policy because it doesn't really suit them. So we do feel that it's also important to address them and kind of help cushion their losses. So we feel domestic PhDs and domestic institutions might not be happy with this policy of PhDs being funded to go abroad because the money that is paid here to PhDs isn't that high. So actually, we feel that our solution might even help kind of increase the salaries of domestic PhDs and in a staggered manner. And once we have this program set up and we have PhD students abroad at institutes, it might also help ease out cross-country collaborations among institutes and research facilities. And this would long-term, I think, even help domestic PhDs and those who are abroad. So this way, we would like to mitigate some of the consequences of our schemes.
Yeah, I think it's really good to have to, thoughtfully consider what could the ripple effects be of something like this. We can't sort of think of it as, maybe sitting in an ivory tower coming up with great ideas, but actually it can't be disconnected from how this might play out, obviously, in reality. So thank you both for that. I'm maybe going to pivot a little bit and perhaps just take a step back from this exercise, right? So I know we caught you at the tail end of a very intense weekend where you've spent a fair bit of, I think, sleepless nights on developing this, thinking through very thoughtfully what a good solution could be for a very persnickety, tough kind of problem. So I think my question to both of you is, what did you find the most challenging when actually working on something like this, when trying to develop a solution? Because the scope of what you were tasked with, I think, was fairly broad. What were your sort of first impressions or the most challenging components of it? Maybe Rohan, if you want to start.
I honestly think that just finding viable solutions to a problem that is not discussed enough was one of the most challenging and interesting things that we did. I don't think solutions are readily available. I don't think enough people are talking about these solutions. So when we had to do our research, when we had to go about, let's say using any framework, do our analysis, and figure out what the right policy alternatives could be, we kept hitting roadblocks at every possible point. And that's to do with how we had to find solutions on the go, how we had to come up with unique ways of approaching a solution, because those are not readily available. There are no readings that are giving you and you're copy pasting them. So for us, it was a lot of practical experiences and combining knowledge and data points to figure out, okay, there is a loophole here. There is something that is being missed. There is something that is not being addressed. And we could potentially find a solution with a very unique outlook. I think that was one of the most fascinating things than anything else. Yeah.
And how about for you, Meher?
Yeah, I think as Rohan rightly mentioned, there's roadblocks at each point. What was the most difficult and also I think most interesting part was to figure out like, why is this a problem exactly? Because you want the government to direct money to something like this. And in a country like India, there's a huge opportunity cost when you have so many problems to work on. Why should we work on just this? So kind of to get to that crux and to kind of make it accessible and convey it in one single line, I think it was challenging and also interesting. And once we had that, coming up with alternatives, I think we were able to do that quite well. But when we had to project the outcomes, I feel like for me, it was a tough, like a bit of a tough problem because you just don't know how exactly to do it. And we're playing with like thousands of crores. So just to imagine that big of a number in my head. So I think that's where I was struggling a bit on a personal level. But I think overall, the good part of this was that you're working in a team. So you kind of balance each other out. So there's someone who's good with data, like Rohan's great with slides. And this way we were all able to, I think, work together seamlessly and come up with the solution. So that was also a great learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like from, the perspective of those who are listening to how you thought through it, there was a narrative that you built, fairly strongly, and you tried to reinforce everything with substantial evidence as well, right? So maybe I'll conclude on a more positive note, since I've already asked you what you found the most challenging. What for you perhaps was the most encouraging or rewarding aspect of the exercise itself? Maybe Rohan, do you want to start again?
I think the fact that everything came together. It so happens when you're working on projects like these or any policy groups or anything else in your life, when you're sort of struggling to make sense of everything, right? And in the process of everything, you're just not sure if it'll come out the way you want it to or in the way you want it to come together. But I'm really glad that it did, in the same vision that we had, in the capacity that we wanted to make it, and the kind of impact that we wanted it to have. I think really great to see that work out.
Yeah. Lovely. And you, Meher, what did you find sort of most encouraging or the most rewarding of the task?
I think the most rewarding and somewhat also surprising for me was when we came up with the final alternative that we would kind of project, because while we were going through the entire exercise of funneling it down, we come up with 5 and we were also asked to come up with something completely radical. In my head, I was thinking, of course, that would be the one that would be the most effective. And then once we put metrics to it and judged it by our criteria, turns out the final solution we proposed wasn't really that radical in the sense that it's completely changing things. It's actually going to change things marginally. State capacity is existent. So it was encouraging in the sense that you can make small tweaks that will actually go a long way if you can just sustain them. And that was very encouraging also from a later point of data perspective. If you want to be in policy, you have to look into the small nitty-gritties of things, and what you finally come down to is something very simple if you just implement it properly.
Yeah. So, I think you both should be very proud of the work that your team has accomplished. I know that I was really glad to be on the evaluation panel and hear, how you thought through some of this. And I know that a fair bit of hard work went into it. So thank you both so much for your time. Thank you both so much for spending so many, at least 4 consecutive days sort of staring this problem dead in the eye. And I think that's really admirable. And to come out on the other side with still standing. For those who can't, there's a visual component to even this recording, and I see both them are still smiling. So I think this bodes well for all of us. But with that, I'll just thank both our guests. Thank you so much, Rohan. Thank you so much, Meher, for just your really good work. And your first ATP, a second congrats.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.